Okay.
Thank you. Oh,
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure for me to get back to the folks at the UD University of Dayton. I used to be a flyer. I'm proud of that, and thank you, everyone, for joining me today. The journey that took me from UD all the way to international development was rather not typical for an engineering student who wants to pursue a career in renewable energies, but it was always fun for me, and I'm excited to share my journey with you. Today, I'm talking about how data could enable international development, and as you may know, energy access is one of the big infrastructure and one of the big geeks in international development. Basically, without energy, a lot of the practices in international development for economic empowerment of low-income countries and people in low-resource communities would not be possible. So there is a very good overlap between energy engineering, renewable energies nowadays, and international development and data management that I assume that you learn a lot about it in this course with Kevin would have a lot to do
oh,
with this
I
too.
only have a couple of students in my class here. In fact, I only have a couple. So it's not for a course. It's open to the university.
Oh, I see.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, either way, it's going to be, I hope, fun. And also, if you have any question during my presentation, feel free to stop me, interrupt me, and ask your questions. Um, Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and then how data shapes our work today and how it's different in low-income countries, in low-resource communities specifically. Then I'm going to talk about how, as a challenge, we need to tackle it and we need to address it. Then I have a couple of case studies. Depending on how much time we have left, I'm going to talk about it. And also we would have a question and answer or discussion if you want at the end. So a little bit my background. Born and raised in Iran. I got my bachelor's in mechanical engineering at Isfahan University of Technology. It was in 2012. I moved to Dayton, Ohio. I pursued renewable and clean energy. Class of 2014. After graduation, I moved back home and I was doing energy consultation for about a year. After that, I decided to further focus on economic development and energy as one infrastructure in economic development. So I started PhD in 2016 at Oregon State University, and I got my PhD in engineering design and applied economics. Then after graduation, I joined Green Empowerment. It's a nonprofit active in international development. Specifically, we work in water and energy infrastructure for the low-income communities that are often remote. And we are specifically focused in 10 program countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I am technical program manager. That means that I review the designs, I design the social studies and impact assessment, monitoring, evaluation projects in my role. Also, I put my Twitter, LinkedIn, and email in case you want to follow me or reach out if you have any further questions. I would be happy to share. So let me start with this. As you know, there is a big gap in our world between high-income countries, developed world, or global north, as there are different terminologies to describe it, and global south, or low-income countries, or developing countries, to some extent underdeveloped countries. And the differences are a lot. You know, the income people have, the welfare, the basically equality, social justice, all of them, you could see a big gap between countries that are generally categorized as high income and countries that are generalized as low income countries. One of the big areas that there is a significant gap today I want to focus on is the data. What you see here is the map of the world for the top 25 countries in terms of generating data. And you see a pattern here, except China and India that are cumulatively more than 2 billion, about 30% of the world population have, they contain about 30% of the world population. The rest of the countries that generate a lot of data are the high income countries, North America and Europe and Australia, and two big economies in Latin America. And this is the descriptive of how data generation and how data is different in high income countries and low income countries. So I would say that given that in our world, information technology and data and ICT, these are the defining factors and infrastructures that shape our day-to-day life significantly. This is not the common practice in a lot of countries across the globe as the way we are experiencing in let's say, United States. So why it really is important is because the way we make decisions for our policies are based on a data journey, the data journey that enables us to every day improve on our current practices is the data we receive that turns to information. That information is then being accompanied by the knowledge that policymakers have, generates insight, and that insight generates action or leads to action. So you see a lot of conversations in policy debates, for instance, or any other thing. Even in social justice issues, people tend to use data a lot. There is this percentage of, racial divide. There is this percentage of, tax revenue going to that level of the population, or households with that level of income contribute this much to the overall taxes. All of them are coming from the accurate data that we have the capacity to collect, transition to information, couple it with the knowledge that we have, and then turn it to insight. These insights that we have in the US are essentially what basically forms our policy approach, what basically defines where are the priorities for United States as a society, as a country, to move on with improvements. For instance, because of the good data we have, we know that we need to move on healthcare. Because of the data, we know that we need to move on A, B, and C, no matter what policies are they. But this is not the practice that happens in a lot of low-income countries. This is basically when policymakers are trying to make a decision for electrification in a low-income country, you may think that they know exactly how many populations they are serving. They know exactly what's the demand they are going to design power plants for, transmission lines for, and things like that. But based on my experience so far, no one actually knows anything like that. I recently came across this operation that runs about 100 healthcare clinics in refugee camps in Uganda. Surprisingly, they don't know which one of their clinics has electricity and which one doesn't have. So this is the level of, unfortunately, this is the level of data that we don't have, but we act. And we act without data. That's why when we talk about a clinic in a refugee camp, this is not necessarily an improvement in public health, because that clinic cannot simply do any tests, cannot simply keep any medicine that requires refrigerators and things like that, because it doesn't have electricity. And unfortunately, we don't know which one has electricity, which one doesn't. So when the data does not exist, we do not have good policy, we do not have good resource allocation for informed international development practices and financing practices. So to better understand it, let me give you how having data could change international development practices. Imagine that we want to provide electricity access in a remote region or in a low-income region of the world. If we have data, that means we have census information, businesses that are running in that region, general behaviors of the people. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. What's current electricity access and what potentials exist in this community for for instance, using natural resources and having income generating activities off of it. All the data that we have in this specific region gives us information. The information would be what's the exact number of population, what's the demographics, job descriptions, and things like that in the community. So if you're talking about a dominantly industrial community, a dominantly farmer, a trade, a community that, you know, significant portion of the populations are fishing or trading. So it basically gives us this information. When we have that information and we have the knowledge, that means people with experience use this information to translate the information to insight. For instance, someone with the experience of, you know, providing electricity for communities with dominant agricultural practices, they know that if you are talking about 100,000 population and dominantly agricultures, then you could initialize co-op activities like, you know, food processing plants and things like that, that could increase the income for people in the communities. You also, about the behaviors and the transition, about the transition of information to knowledge, one of the things is behaviors. For instance, in Southeast Asia, when you're designing for electricity access, rice cooking, and rice specifically, is one of the main elements of meals in the region. So when you're providing electricity access, households are more likely to use rice cookers, the same rice cookers that we have in our kitchens, and simply use. It's going to be sometimes a luxury if a household could have access to it. So when you know that rice cookers are one of the main electricity consumers in your network that you're designing, you are transitioning a behavioral data to insight, so to knowledge, so that knowledge enables the insight or policymakers to take it into account and design a system that basically reflects the requirements of the communities that you are designing these systems for. So in general, the knowledge is boiling down to insights like, you know, this is gonna be the best system size we need for this community. This is the transmission lines that could serve. This is the grid capacity that could basically be tapped to for these communities. And then you develop the policy. We need this much money, we need this investment portfolio, and we need this to have reliable and sustainable electricity access for this region. And then it turns out to actions like by organizations like World Bank, UN, or governments. They provide financial resources required, logistics required, and the action at the end of the day would be a reliable and sustainable electricity for a community. This is the ideal scenario, but think about it, that this is not going to happen. Why it's not happening? Let me give you one example. Early on in my PhD, I had to do 2 data collections. One was in Honduras, the other one was in Uganda. When I did my data collection in Honduras from a sample size of about 400 households in 8 villages, it cost $10,000 for us, and it took 2 months to get that data. And it was just enormous. Think about it, that $10,000 was part of a $40,000 project that wanted to expand access to clean cooking technologies, just like this technology you see on the picture in the right. These cooking practice, these improved cook stoves basically have less pollution when you're using them. So less pollution causes less public health consequences. So the whole project to increase access to these cook stoves, improved cook stoves, was $40,000, and 25% of it just went for data collection. This is not something similar to what we spend in the US for data. Here, data is much cheaper, much abundant, and like, you know, we could not even compare why it's logistically challenging and technically difficult to get that data. The other study in Uganda was even more expensive because the communities were more remote, logistically more challenging to get to, and it cost us $20,000 only to survey 175 households in 3 villages, and it took us 1 month to get that data. Just think about it, if you want to survey 175 households in the US, how much you're going to spend. It's probably much less than it, even if you, when you adjust it for labor rates that are different between Uganda and the US. So it's expensive, it's technologically challenging, logistically challenging to get those data, and that's why we don't have data. And to go back, if we don't have good data, then it just trickles down and results in we don't have a good policy. We don't have a policy to provide reliable and sustainable access to electricity or anything that the policy intends to do, because the data does not exist. And unfortunately, it means that we do have the financial resources in majority of the cases. World Bank is pretty rich, UN is pretty rich, governments are rich too, and they are allocating financial resources, but because of this lack to data access, those financial resources are not necessarily translating to good actions on the ground. So what basically is the data scarcity here means is that when we do not have contextual awareness, decision makers cannot make good decisions. In mechanical engineering design, there's a term for it called frontier design. That's where the designer is designing for a community or a frontier user that's beyond understanding of the designer. Let's say that I'm the designer of Apple iPhone and I designed it based in California. This is the technology that's supposed to be used everywhere on the planet. And now I don't know, I don't have any understanding that what would be the requirements, the contextual requirements of a person who lives in, let's say, a very northern countries with average temperatures always like, less than certain temperatures that I always experience in Bay Area. So when I don't have that cultural or contextual awareness, my designs are not necessarily representatives of the needs of that particular user. So we need as designers to know about those contextual awarenesses, those contextual elements, those user behaviors to design appropriately. Just simply, if I'm a designer designing an electricity grid, I'm based in the US and I'm designing for Southeast Asia without having the knowledge of, the popularity of rice cookers, electric rice cookers in the communities, chances are that I'm not designing a good I'm not modeling the demand correctly, so that when I'm installing the system and everyone plugs in their rice cookers in a certain time of the day, we have a huge spike, a huge peak in the demand that basically shuts the whole grid down. So the contextual awareness really matters, and data scarcity is just not letting us or designers in general to have that contextual awareness. And then when we do not have that awareness, we tend to oversimplify everything. Engineers generally simplify realities to make models that they could work with. When we're working with suspension systems designed for cars, we really start with a very simple model for analysis, and then we build upon it until we get to a test situation and then improve on it, right? But we do not have that luxury when we're talking about human subjects and talking about contexts that are logistically challenging to access to, right? That's why people usually oversimplify everything. For instance, if it's about electricity access, people tend to simplify it to, hey, we just need to provide them with lighting. And it's just not good, because you only provide lighting and you don't really provide, you don't see the whole picture. When I have more lighting during the night, what am I going to do with that lighting? Just sitting around doing nothing? This is not going to happen. So when we don't capture the whole reality on the system, in the situation, it basically leads us to design a system that's not representative of cultural needs and significances. It's not even representative of activities that could lead the communities, especially communities and people at the bottom of the pyramid, to have an upward mobility in their systems, right? So this is a big problem. In addition, we do not have accountability post-interventions when there's a data scarcity happening. So what it really means is that we do something on the ground. Let's say that I design a system, an electricity access system. It's being implemented and I'm gone from that community. basically no one has the capacity to see how much of a good job I've done. Do I really empower the community to move upward in terms of, livelihood improvements or economic activities, economic growth, or is the system actually working or not? So no one knows what happens afterward. This actually blows back in many cases that communities lose trust for strangers who actually have good intentions, but their actions are not necessarily durable, reliable, and sustainable. That's why a lot of these communities, when they see strangers, they have terminologies like muzungus. In Uganda, they use muzungus for white people who come to the context to do things and do projects. So when a muzungu is doing a project, chances are that people don't take them seriously, and they say, okay, this is one other example of failures that people do something, they leave the context, and then this situation gets worse, and no one is going to be accountable for it. The fourth one is that there is even no limitation, there's even no time or resources for corrective actions. When you do have data on how your system's performing, even if the person who installed the system, the person who's responsible for it, is not able to do something for it, no one else also is aware of it. So let's say that in a community that has a problem with their electricity access, there is resources, but another organization comes to that community and they are not aware of it, so they invest in something else that might be not as a priority for the community as that electricity access is. So we do not have that information. We cannot share it with the organizations to generally talk about, like, let's say that I spent $40,000, developed this mini grid for this community. The mini grid has issues. No one knows about it, but chances are if I had $5,000, I could have fixed it. There is another organization spending $10,000 in the community just for education in terms of AIDS prevention and things like that. And it's just for education. If they knew that 5,000 could go to better infrastructure for electricity, they might have been able to provide that resources while they are in the community doing that education. With a little bit extra cost, they could fix that grid too. And it's not happening usually because the data is not being shared. The data is not there. So with those problems, what should we do as engineers? We should either find a way or build one. And what should we do for data scarcity in international development? Well, we should be aware of these challenges when we are designing research studies. When we're designing a project, we need to be aware that, hey, there are challenges, the data is going to be scarce, and when we know that, we better design it. We better design a study that uses minimum data for the biggest conclusions that could basically shape our way to approach that problem. In addition, we need to acknowledge that there are unknown unknowns in this system. So as you may be aware of, there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, there are unknown knowns, and there are unknown unknowns. These are the risks. These are uncertainties in these projects. We have no idea about them until we actually go to the field, do something, and then we could learn about them. So when we know that there are unknown unknowns in these projects, then we could put some basically contingency plans in different scenarios. And if this happens, we got to do this. If that happens, we got to do this. We need to be open and flexible and resilient in our approaches when we want to do projects in data scarce communities. And then we need to be clear on our conclusions and the way we talk about these projects. It should be different than the communities and designs when we talk about data abundance. For instance, if I want to change a grid in a mini grid of a community in the US to make it more solar based, there is a different terminology and there's a different attitude and confidence I have as opposed to when I'm talking about a mini grid installation in a remote community in a low income country. It's because I know more. I have LiDAR data access to the community, aerial photos. I have data access like for years of data consumption of those communities. accurate population data, and I exactly know how much of solar I could get based on the number of, area that I'm going to cover with my PV panels. Everything is pretty clear for me because there is data abundance here. But when I'm talking about building a system in a data scarce community, I should be aware of the things that I don't know. I should be cautious when I talk about it. If I say that my system with, like, let's say X number of panels is going to generate Y kilowatts, then it's really need to be, with a very good threshold and margin of error, because things may happen in a different way. The panels might not be high quality. There will be more rain as presented in weather data that I have access to, and a lot of other things. So the language should change. We should recognize the difference that is underlying the assumptions I have and the data I don't have in these communities. I also need to engage with local experts. This is particularly important because recently I saw a data collection, a survey happening in Iran, and they were asking certain questions in a certain way. And it was, to me, it was so obvious that the results are biased because the terminologies they were using were in Farsi, they were dubious. They could be interpreted in different ways. So having that local knowledge, understanding the native language, understanding the context, I could easily tell the person who designed the questionnaire was not really aware of them. The choice of words was not correct, and the results were biased. Actually, people were sharing those in Twitter, acknowledging, hey, this should not be right. This is against, like, our experiences, in country experiences are against it. So how come the data and findings are this biased or inflated? Basically, local knowledge really could shape the whole study. There are nuances that you may think that they are just, very small or negligible, but matter a lot. Choice of color is really something that probably we think toward end of our analysis when we want to pick a technology. It turns out that if a technology, no matter how good it is yellow in certain communities, that is the color of demons. So you should not really paint your technologies yellow when you're presenting it to that community. How you could know that before you actually design that technology? Have some local experts around you, share the study with them, share the intentions with them, and engage them, actively engage them in your whole process so that they could weigh in based on their knowledge. So in general, my way of doing data collection is this process that I presented here. It's a very, I didn't mean it to be very lengthy and wordy. It turns out really any of these steps have been crucial in my work. And I say based on the failures I've had in this field. So each of these steps that you see here, I've had a failure that basically forced me to do it and adopt it for my future projects. One thing that I really want to talk about is that if you have a chance to take elective courses in your program, take the design anthropology courses, the anthropology courses that teach you how to do data collection from human subjects. These are very important courses, and it doesn't matter if you're a biostatistician or an energy expert or a, I don't know, mechanical engineer working on a car. If you have certain human users in your future work, then you gotta know something about human subjects. You gotta know how humans generally behave, or how you should ask questions the right way from humans, because we have all different ways our minds are wired, so we think differently. I'm not gonna go through all of them in detail, but if you have any question about them, let me know. I guess, let me see if anyone has a question.
No, that was, I really like that idea, Mohammed.
Yeah.
Qualitative research is what sociology calls that. So really, really good. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm gonna talk about my first, how much time do we have left? Oh, we're at 30 minutes. So Kevin, should we stop here?
Can you, so you have a case study? It would be nice to hear one of your case studies for sure.
Sure, sure.
Okay.
So but my whole PhD was an innovative idea. It was actually funded by NSF back in the time, and it took me 3 years to complete it. I've published it in 3 journal papers, and if you're interested, you could follow up on it. But generally, what I did was I used theory of planned behavior. This is a behavioral theory that says every action we do comes from our intentions, and intentions come from 3 categories. If my slides help me. Yes, first category is the individual attitude toward behavior we have. Let's say that you want to pick a transportation method to go to school every day. What's your attitude toward biking? What's your attitude toward taking a bus? And what's your attitude toward driving a Lamborghini to school every day? This is your personal idea about it. So, for instance, the study that I did in my PhD was for using improved cook stoves and having higher adoption rate to improve cook stoves in low-income countries. And the people's attitude toward inhaling a smoke from a cook stove was one of the categories of questions that I had in my surveys. The other attitude is social pressure. So if you're around a lot of environmentalist folks, then you are more likely to have a social pressure to bike to school rather than taking a Lamborghini every day to school. Or if you have a lot of pretentious people, I assume, around you, taking a Lamborghini to school would be really cool. So you have a high desire for doing that. In my specific example in my research was that if people who are important to me are using a cook stove, an improved one, then chances are that I'm more obliged to follow that social pattern and adopt one. The third category would be perceived behavioral control. These are like the categories that basically, from a psychological standpoint, separates people who have severe addictions to anything from people who don't have it. So we do have something in mind that, let's say that I really like smoking when I'm like listening to course material, but smoking is prohibited in campus. But how much control I have over resisting that feeling in myself is covered in that category. And it's like, similarly, if it's too difficult for me, for instance, to have access to a Lamborghini to drive it every day to school, then probably that element of overshadows the intention that I have to drive it every day. So if it's difficult to access to improve cook stove was the attribute that we were investigating in our study for cook stove adoption. And all of them are going to say, what's my intention for adopting a cook stove? This intention is on Likert scale from like strongly unlikely to strongly likely. This is going to shape my behavior at the end. So this, in general, this is a formula. Let me quickly come here. Usually engineers, when they want to predict market share of new technologies, they use utility functions. Utility functions tell how much value each action has for me. These utility functions are always a function of technology design attributes, demographics, and what choices we have, really. Let's say if I want to pick a phone, iPhone, Samsung, I don't know, BlackBerry, things like that. What's the utility each one of these provides for me? For instance, right now, the Clubhouse app is specifically for iPhone users. So if you're really into that social media, the utility that iPhone provides for you is much more than Android or other like Windows phones. So that utility defines overall the market share of that product. And my contribution was that I added user behavioral attributes that I discussed earlier, those TPB attributes, to this equation to quantitatively measure the product market share in a low-income country based on behavioral attributes. This is my contribution. And as I said, so I added TPB in models, and every time I added another attribute of TPB, I had a better prediction of overall market share of technologies in low-income countries. In this study, I used about 500 observations in Honduras and Uganda. I could recognize how social elements in Honduras play differently than social elements in Uganda. In Uganda, people have less trust for Muzumbus coming to communities presenting a technology. In Honduras, they are more open to it. In Honduras, if your neighbors are using something, chances are that you use that because you have a very stronger social type compared to Uganda communities that, Uganda communities are more individualistic than Honduran ones. So these are big findings that basically, when you have these findings before you design the technology, it helps you to design a technology that's more representative of the needs, but also an intervention plan, a policy or information campaign that helps the people to better learn about your technology and learn how to adopt it. This generally was the outcome of it. I think I'm not going to go through the second case study. Kevin has the data for health clinics, and if you take that course that Kevin has, I know not many of you don't take it, but if you take it, I provided Kevin with those data I got in this project. You could prioritize health clinics for electricity access based on multiple attributes that I collected in that.
Super cool. Hey, Mohammed, can you stop sharing?
Yeah.
So that we can, I'm gonna, hey everybody, now it's time. Thank you. Everybody, can we maybe just, oops, snap our fingers or something to give them a hand? Yeah, nice. Hey, that was really interesting. Do you folks have, Megan gives a thumbs up. So do you have questions, anybody? I have a few comments and questions, but I'll wait for you guys. Anybody?
I have a question. When you were at Dayton, what sort of research opportunities did you partake in, or what things in the college life did you like the most, education-wise?
Yeah, great question. So for me, have you guys seen the Battleground Against Global Warming lab in the first floor of, yeah, you haven't. So there is an RCL lab. I don't know if you're utilizing it or not.
I think it's actually been usurped by the faculty.
Okay, so
we have a faculty usurper in our midst.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Anyway, so that was I was honored to start that lab and design a test stand for fan curves in that. Besides that, I was when I did my undergrad, I realized that being an engineer and not having any idea about the economics or policy making is not going to lead to effective communication that engineers could have to improve livelihood in the societies. We may exactly know, like, I assume engineers would know about energy storage, electric cars way before Elon Musk started Tesla. But it's like, it takes a huge effort for an engineering concept that's really awesome to actually lead to an impact in the society. And specifically in the time that we are struggling with climate change, it is really important that the engineering skills we learn and we could put in practice for impact in the society really go to that impact. To do that, you need to understand the policy, you need to understand the economic. And it was really good. I attended a couple of courses like Introduction to Public Policy. I took a course in environmental economics while I was at UD, and then my master's thesis was an economic input-output analysis I did for battery recycling. Basically, I reviewed the technologies for dry cell battery recycling, and I was saying if we adopt a stronger recycling policy, it's not going to actually lead to any bad outcome for the economy. It's actually going to make it improve it. So I guess this is really important for engineers to have a good understanding and grasp of the whole picture.
Other questions, folks?
When you took that the economic classes, was that like a part of the curriculum, or did you go out your way to do something of that caliber?
It was elective. Yeah.
Yeah. Elective, yeah. Although, so he was in the RCL program, and one of the things that we have believed in from the beginning is the value of learning outside of engineering. And so, for example, I'm advising all students to think more broadly about their course options, you know, even beyond the engineering courses. So it maybe, and there have been others like you along the way. So good question, Tyrone. Anybody else? I've got some to add. If I really enjoyed this talk, Mohammed. Very, very interesting. I hadn't actually ever heard anything like it. So super good. Hey, I have one point. So, and why this is so important. My daughter was actually working rurally in Cameroon as she was at a health clinic in a remote area that had theoretically power. And she was actually supporting a surgeon who was doing a surgery at the time. And to be honest, the power died. And so she had to get a battery lamp going. The surgeon had to work without power, and it was devastating. It's why what you're doing is so important. I guess the second comment I have is, you know, we have ethos at the University of Dayton where students are going all over the world. And there's also organizations like Engineers Without Borders. But it occurs to me that these organizations and the students that are actually going to these locations can actually be considered as an army of data collectors. If you haven't thought of that, then let's talk. Because, you know, a big problem is cost, and I think that they could help you maybe reduce some of that cost, perhaps.
Yeah,
I know, and also we're adding value in terms of policy, maybe in ways that we frankly aren't adding value. So, you know, in much of what we do, it's great experience for students, but not always the best experience for the partners that we work with.
yeah, it's my pleasure, Kevin. And it's really interesting that I actually had a meeting about it an hour ago, and a couple of folks are working on basically make profit out of data in low-income countries. So basically, they are working on developing a platform to count number of salmon fishes that they could, like fishers in low-income communities could spot in the region they are working in, and sell that data to environmental organizations or regulatory branches of UN or governments to basically provide a source of revenue for fishers, and say, hey, this is the migration plan of salmon fishes, this is the migration plan of these certain, you know, marine animals going around, and people could make money out of it. I don't know how that's gonna turn out, but I'm glad that we talk about, you know, how we could have data coming in our practices from other people that are in the field. One of the things that I've done recently was for basically doing evaluation impact assessment in an operation of one of our sister companies, was that I developed these forms on phone that people with no information could go to the communities. Maybe they have something else to do, but at the same time, the form is going to ask them, hey, could you simply take a photo of their treatment facility? And if I don't see any chlorine in that treatment facility, it indicates that people are not really treating that water. So we should definitely use those proxies for data collection.
Yeah, I just want to, one final comment on my end. So Mohammed has provided my class in energy informatics data looking at hospitals, I think in Uganda, clinics and hospitals in Uganda. And one of the things that we're trying to determine is effectively what characteristics are associated with the medical clinics, et cetera, that are that have greater reliability and energy. And I think one of the things we'll certainly find is that those clinics and hospitals which have solar kind of backing up what they do or solely providing energy are actually having more reliable access to power. So super cool. Hey, this was such a great talk. I think I've never heard anything like this. So so good to hear this. Not just, so data in the United States is so abundant. It's crazy. We're using big data to improve our energy effectiveness and advance renewable energy. This is so needed. So we really appreciate you being here. Hey, I'll send you an email. I will want your address. So I got something to send you. But everybody, one last final round of applause. Oh, one last thing. March 11th, let me just share my screen real quick. So we have a speaker next week. Her name is Emily Burns, and she is actually a senior in at the University of Dayton organizing a program called Revolve, which is really an awesome organization. Emily's been leading this for several years, but the intent is to bring solar to nonprofits of all types all over the country, but she's the lead in Dayton. And I think you'll find that she's got a lot to say. And frankly, anybody interested, she needs your help. So that's March 11th at 8, so, or at 7, I'm sorry. And thank you, Mohammed. So good, thank you. Everybody, one last thumbs up or snap. It was great to see some new faces and names today, Matt and Tyrone as an example. Hope you'll come back. If anybody ever has any questions about energy internships, you know, academics, career, or anything, I'm just posting my email address. You're welcome to reach out and ask away. Okay? So everybody got that? Mohammed, that was so good. Did I hear a baby in the background?
Not my background.
No, okay, got it. Jack, that may have been you. No.
My cat's been asleep, so it wasn't me.
Okay. Hey, everybody, thanks for coming. Have a good night. Mohammed, so good. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure being with you guys. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.